to begin with a historical assessment of slavery. It existed in many countries, but we still associate it with sub-Saharan Africans. Is it something we do because it's hard to associate slavery with developing or developed democracies?
Slavery was global, but more recent and more institutionalized slavery is 500 years old, and it's essentially the slavery of the Atlantic world, in which the majority population that was enslaved was sub-Saharan Africans. And so now when we think about enslavement, we don't think about Europeans who were enslaved in North Africa, for example. We think about sub-Saharan Africans who were enslaved in the Americas. They were not the only Africans who were enslaved. Africans were enslaved in India, in the Gulf states, in the Indian Ocean. But what we know, we who are Atlantic people, we only think about the Atlantic, and that means sub-Saharan Africans.
In 1994, the UNESCO launched the Slave Route Project. Could you talk a little bit about this project?
Or what the Slave Route Project within UNESCO has essentially done is to try to break the silence, that's their terminology, break the silence about this enslavement of Africans, mainly in the Atlantic world, but also elsewhere. I think the project has been very good in raising consciousnesses, in bringing up the issue of enslavement in places in which it wasn't talked about. North Africa, for example. I mean, it wasn't talked about in an international forum. I went to a conference in India that was about the African diaspora in India, in Asia, and UNESCO was part of the sponsors of that. So it's the only cultural institution with a global vision. And so it's the only cultural institution that has done what it has done. It needs to do more. It's actually a very small office, the Slave Route Project, and therefore I think that the people who work there have done a pretty good job. But it would be wonderful if there were more of a job being done.
Now, what about Brazil? Talking about Brazil specifically, we were the last major nation to abolish slavery. In your opinion, is Brazil doing well?
And I think it is very important to emphasize the fact that 45% of Africans who were enslaved in the Americas came to Brazil. Only about 5% went to British North America, that's mainly become the United States now. So Brazil has always had more Africans than everybody else and more African culture. It used to be really good to be North American. Now I think it's pretty good to be Afro-Brazilian. It's pretty good to be Brazilian because in contrast to the United States, where we had official open segregation in the South and the kind of subtle segregation like in Brazil in the North, Brazil never acknowledged its racism. It was a racial democracy, just a wonderful place in which even Afro-Brazilians believed this, used to believe this. Not everybody, but some people. Now, Brazil is so far ahead of us in the United States in changing the nature of the culture and acknowledging this African presence. The law, I wish we could have a federal law like you have 10,639, the first law that Lula signed. I love that law that says you have to teach Afro-Brazilian and African culture. In schools. Well, it's impossible in the United States because the federal government doesn't control education, so there's no way to say everybody's got to learn the same thing. But Brazil is acknowledging that you can't tell the story of Brazil and leave out 45% of the original population. Now, what is it, 51.1% of the current population defines itself as Afro-Brazilian? Well, if you're going to talk about Brazilian culture, the majority's got to be in there.
In Brazil, the governments of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Lula, and Rousseff have also supported affirmative action. We have grants available for black students, for example, in private universities, and race admissions quotas in public universities. How do you evaluate these kinds of action?
Given that for 500 years, almost 500 years in Brazil, almost 400 years in the United States, Africans and African descendants worked for free. That's a long time. And so I do think it's time for a little payback. And this working for free of Africans and African descendants enriched someone else, and the someone else got all the good positions in the society, got all the benefits of the society. So I think it is time for a a little compensation. And in the United States, the issue was there should be affirmative action in situations where damage was obvious to African descendants for having been deprived of opportunities. And as a result, I mean, there were those detractors who said, well, this is just about putting incompetent people into positions, except that's not what happened at all. It was African Americans who were terribly well prepared, but who, because of being African Americans, were not considered for positions. I mean, as an African American, one of the things I learned that in order to be as good, I had to be twice, maybe 4 times as good to get the same kind of job. So what affirmative action did for us was to allow people who were very well prepared to have the kind of position they deserved. And in Brazil, I understand that there are now quotas. I think that this is essential because, I mean, in the Americas, African descendants in Brazil, in the United States, every place, have been disadvantaged, absolutely disadvantaged in the category of people who are enslaved for hundreds of years. And so to say, well, for the next 10 years, we're going to compensate. 10 years is not very much, 20 years, whatever. It's not very much as compared to the hundreds of years for which Africans and African diasporans were enslaved. I think it's absolutely reasonable that there be affirmative action of all sorts. It's the only way things will change.
Many Brazilian universities have adopted less controversial social quotas. Which of the two do you recommend?
I think that the issue is really racism. I know that there are poor people, and there are poor people every place, and poor people come in any color, and it's not good for anybody to be poor. But the issue of affirmative action is really for the victims of enslavement, and the victims of enslavement are African descendants.
Although Brazil has progressed a lot reducing poverty, we still have a social gap between blacks and whites here. Do you think affirmative action is the solution?
Any ways in which African descendants are given access to opportunities, that will help. But that will not eliminate poverty, because poverty, the African descendant poverty, is a result of the fact that African descendants worked for free for hundreds of years, and when emancipation happened, I'm not sure that African descendants were compensated for generations of labor. I don't think they were compensated anyplace in the Americas. So that means that African descendants started way behind. And when slavery ended, that doesn't mean that everything was fine and everybody was equal. If I use the example of the United States, after slavery, there was a period of Reconstruction in which there was some access for African descendants. Okay, that ended. I think Obama said something like he was glad to be president because if he were just a regular black man in the street, he wouldn't be able to get a taxi so easily. So I think it's important to understand how the Americas became what they are. They became what they are. The laborers were Africans, and it was free. So for 400 or 500 years of free labor, I think all kinds of compensatory programs need to be created to counteract hundreds of years.
What would you say then to those people that argue that those compensatory programs risk creating more racial tension?
I would say that it seems to me like these are people who want to create, to maintain a situation of artificial privilege for themselves and enforced inequality for others, and an enforcement of the inability to have access to equal opportunities. I mean, in the States we talk about equal opportunity, and the purpose of affirmative action was to not give an unfair advantage to the people who had been disadvantaged, but to create equal opportunity. And that's what has not existed, equal opportunity. So if there's equal opportunity, then fine, but there isn't.
We have talked about quotas, affirmative action, history a little bit. Now focusing on political representation. You know that we use proportional representation for the lower chamber to elect federal deputies. And although we use proportional representation, blacks are so poorly represented, as well as women. How could we counteract for that?
To run for office, you've got to have money. So if you're poor, then how are you going to run for office? Okay? So I suspect that when more African descendants are less poor and better educated because they have access to better educations, there will be more African descendants who think, you know, I can run for office. One of the issues is thinking you can do that, thinking you can be that. Now you need some models, so there are not a lot of models either. In Brazil, there are more in the United States, not enough. Women have been told, your place is in the kitchen. You've got to take care of your husband. Let him run for office, right? He's qualified. You're not because you're a woman. Now, we know that all this is absurd at this point, but not all of us know this is absurd. So I think several things have to happen. One, African descendants need to get more money. Women need to get their own money. And the attitude, the internal attitude needs to change to, yes, I can do this too.
Now, I understand this is not your first time in Brazil, that you've been traveling a lot. Do you think that culture has changed?
I began to come to Brazil in the 70s, and my first visit to Bahia, of course, I went to other places, I think I came here, but it was Bahia that impressed me most because I was interested in Afro-Brazilian culture. And the first time I just loved the culture, it was magic. The second time I saw all the inequality and I hated it. Then I began to come more and see more aspects of the culture. One of a white Brazilian came to the United States and said, you know, the problem with this country is there are not enough Africans. Yeah, so it wasn't as interesting as Brazil to him. He said, oh, Brazil is a better place to live. The culture is more interesting because we have more African culture. And I agree with him. When I began to come to Brazil, it was still the dictatorship when Afro-Brazilians couldn't talk about racism. Where they had to use music and dance as ways of asserting culture. There was the Black Rio phenomenon, and that was an identification with U.S. African Americans. Then I watched the expression of Afro-Brazilians identifying with other African descendant cultures, with reggae from Jamaica, then with the independent Lusophone African countries. The creation of Afro-Bloc carnival groups in Bahia, for example, that were teachers of African culture, that were teachers that black is beautiful. That was wonderful. Now, it is there are two things. One, it's visible to me that Afro-Brazilians have acquired, as a result of a lot of organization and efforts, have acquired more places in the society. The other issue, though, is the mere fact that Brazil says we have to teach culture of African origin to everybody is an acknowledgement that Brazil is, I think this is very important, the second African country in the world after Nigeria in terms of population. Yes. The fact that Brazil, the census says, well, 51.1% of the population identifies as African descendant.
So they need also to appear on TV, on ads,
absolutely.
In propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. There needs to be a proportional representation. And, culture doesn't change from one day to the next, but it needs to change a little quicker than it seems to be doing. Given the preponderance of Afro-Brazilians, I expect that the same thing will happen in Brazil, that Brazil will catch up in its story of itself to what its real, very rich cultural story is.
Sheila Walker, thank you very much for this interview.
You're welcome, I enjoyed it.
E muito obrigada pela sua audiência. Até a próxima.